They thought I was signing my ending, quietly, gratefully, invisibly. What they didn't realize was that 20 years leaves fingerprints in places no one thinks to check. And when legal opened the ownership register, the room went silent for a reason they never saw coming. 20 years is long enough to memorize the rhythm of a building. I knew which elevator sighed before reaching the executive floor. I knew the exact second the lobby lights shifted from morning gold to corporate white. I knew the way the glass walls of conference room C hummed when the air conditioning kicked in too aggressively during budget season. I had given this place my youth, my discipline, my quiet loyalty. And on a gray Tuesday at 9:14 a.m., they handed me my exit papers. The envelope was heavy, too heavy for something so thin. "It's just restructuring," Martin said, smoothing his tie like he was calming a nervous child. He didn't meet my eyes. He stared at the table, at the grain of the wood, at anything but me. Restructuring. That word is corporate perfume. It smells neutral. It hides decay. I listened as HR recited phrases that had been rehearsed to sound compassionate. "We value your contributions." This wasn't easy. "You'll receive a transition package." I almost admired the choreography. Almost. But there was something odd in the room, a flicker of discomfort that didn't match the script. A glance exchanged between legal and finance, a pause that lasted half a second too long, and I noticed. They slid the exit papers toward me like a final offering. I read every line. Slowly. My pen hovered for a moment, not out of hesitation, but calculation. Then I signed. Martin exhaled in relief. That was his first mistake. The second came 10 minutes later. "Let's finalize the ownership register update before she leaves," someone from legal said casually, as if I were already part of the past tense. Ownership register. The phrase floated in the air like dust in sunlight. Most people in the company didn't even know what it contained. They assumed it was a technical formality, something filed away in digital archives with passwords no one remembered. I had never corrected that assumption. The laptop was connected to the conference screen. Blue background, white interface, the cursor blinked, legal scrolled, names appeared. Executives, board members, investment entities, percentages aligned neatly beside them like obedient soldiers. "Remove access rights," Martin instructed. His voice had regained confidence now, clean, efficient. I sat quietly. The scrolling stopped. There was a pause, then another. "Why?" The junior associate leaned closer to the screen. "Why is her name listed as owner?" Silence doesn't always fall dramatically. Sometimes it tightens, like a wire being pulled. My name glowed there, not under staff, not under management. Owner. A modest percentage, small enough not to attract applause, large enough to require explanation. Martin blinked. "That's not possible." But it was. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the faint tremor of adrenaline under my skin. Not panic, not fear. Just the body recognizing a turning point. "It must be an error," HR whispered. Legal cleared his throat. "The ownership register is cross-verified annually. Errors don't pass audit." Another silence. Thicker this time. They looked at me as if I had suddenly changed shape. The irony tasted almost sweet. 20 years ago, when the company was nothing but rented desks and ambition stitched together with caffeine, someone had needed a guarantor for a critical operational line, a quiet signature, a temporary technical solution. Nothing public, nothing dramatic. I had signed then, too, and I had never asked to be removed. Back in those days, they called me the backbone. Not to my face, of course. But I heard things. I always did. Ownership isn't always about applause. Sometimes it's paperwork. Sometimes it's the fine print no one revisits because it feels inconvenient. Legal scrolled again, hoping reality would rearrange itself. It didn't. Martin's jaw tightened. "How long has that been there?" "Since incorporation," Legal replied. A pulse beat behind my ribs. 20 years. The room felt smaller, the glass walls suddenly transparent in a different way. I could see reflections of their expressions: confusion, irritation, calculation. No one had thought to check, because I was reliable, predictable, loyal, invisible. Martin tried to recover the room. "We'll need to review this. It's probably symbolic." Symbolic. There's something amusing about being told your legal standing is decorative. I finally spoke, calmly. If you'd like, we can review the original agreements. I kept copies. That landed harder than I expected. You kept copies? HR asked, as if documentation were a rebellious act. Of everything, I said. Another glance between legal and finance, this one sharper. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 2 degrees, or maybe it was just perception. Power shifts change air pressure. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I felt something more precise than that. A line straightening inside me. They had invited me to sign my exit like a formality, like a closing chapter already written. But stories written in haste tend to miss footnotes. And footnotes matter. Martin leaned back, forcing a thin smile. We'll handle this internally. I nodded. Of course they would. But something had already slipped beyond their control, because the ownership register isn't just a document. It's evidence, and evidence once seen cannot be unseen. As I gathered my bag, I caught my reflection in the glass. I didn't look defeated. I looked awake. The building's rhythm hadn't changed. The elevator still sighed. The lobby lights still glowed white, but beneath the surface, something had shifted like tectonic plates preparing for a quiet earthquake. They thought they had cut me loose. They didn't realize they had just opened a file that would refuse to close. And if you think the story ends with a simple clerical oversight, you haven't seen what happens when paperwork remembers what people conveniently forget. The elevator doors closed with their usual tired sigh, but this time the sound felt ceremonial, not an ending, an intermission. I didn't rush to leave. Instead of heading straight to the lobby, I stopped by my office. The glass door still bore my name in discreet silver lettering. No one had removed it yet. The company moved fast with people, slower with symbols. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and jasmine tea. My desk was clean, always was. No chaotic stacks, no dramatic "I was wronged" mess. Just ordered folders labeled in neat, deliberate handwriting. 20 years teach you many things. The most important? Always archive your own story. I opened the bottom drawer. There it was. A leather folder, worn at the edges but still dignified. Inside, copies of incorporation agreements, board minutes from the first 3 years, financial guarantees, and the addendum, my favorite word in the English language. Addendums are where truth hides politely. I ran my fingers over the signature page. My younger handwriting looked almost hopeful. Back then, they had needed credibility. A line of credit secured. Someone willing to assume temporary legal exposure so the company could secure a critical partnership. The lawyers had framed it as transitional equity documentation. A placeholder. Placeholders have a habit of becoming permanent when everyone benefits. I slipped the folder into my bag. 2 floors above, I could almost feel the tension spreading like spilled ink. Legal would be pulling digital archives. Finance would be calculating exposure. Martin would be rewriting the narrative in his head, trying to remember how this detail slipped past him. But here's the thing about the ownership register. It doesn't respond to narratives. It responds to facts. My phone vibrated. Unknown internal number. I answered. We need to clarify something, legal said, voice carefully neutral. Of course, I replied, just as neutral. There appears to be an early-stage equity allocation in your name. It may have been procedural. Procedural. I leaned against my desk, letting the words settle between us. It was attached to the operational guarantee, I said, the one that secured our first major supplier contract. A pause. They were searching now, not the register, memory. That was dissolved years ago, he said. The liability was, I corrected softly, the equity clause required written removal, co-signed by all founding members. Silence. Paper rustling, keyboard tapping, and then, quieter than before, we're not finding a removal document. Of course you're not. I closed my office blinds halfway. The corridor outside felt suddenly more observant. I never received one, I said. The line remained open, but no one spoke. I could imagine them pulling up the audit trail, the annual cross-verifications. Each year, my name confirmed. Each year, no objection raised. Each year, accepted. Accepted. Legal cleared his throat again. We'll need to convene a review. I assumed so. I ended the call gently, not triumphantly. Victory doesn't need volume. I walked through the floor slowly, noticing how conversations dipped when I passed. News travels faster than email in corporate spaces. Eyes followed me, not with pity anymore, but with calculation. 20 years of loyalty can be dismissed in one meeting. 20 years of documentation? Much harder. Near the exit, I ran into Sophia from compliance. Her expression flickered between concern and curiosity. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Depends what you heard." "That your name is in the ownership register." "It is." She blinked. "They're saying it's complicated." I smiled faintly. Complicated is another word for binding. She exhaled sharply, almost laughing before catching herself. They didn't see this coming. No, they didn't. The building felt different now. Same walls, same polished floors reflecting overhead lights, but the atmosphere had thickened, like before a storm that hasn't yet decided where to strike. Outside, the city air was cool, traffic murmured, life continued, indifferent to boardroom tension. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt steady. There's a quiet power in being underestimated for 2 decades. People tell you things. They assume you won't act. They assume loyalty equals passivity. They confuse patience with absence. My phone buzzed again. This time, Martin. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "This situation is unusual," he began. "Yes. We'll resolve it internally. There's no need to escalate." Escalate, such a telling word. "I have no intention of escalating," I said calmly, "but I do intend to protect my legal position." Another pause. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. There it was. The question behind the restructuring. Not what happened. Not how did we miss this? But what do you want? I stepped toward the crosswalk, watching the pedestrian light flicker red to green. "I want clarity," I replied, "and recognition of what already exists." No threats, no demands, just fact. He inhaled sharply. "We'll be in touch." The call ended. I stood there a moment longer, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, not triumph, but alignment. For years, I had absorbed pressure so the structure could stand. Now the structure had to acknowledge the beam it tried to remove. Back upstairs, they would be reviewing early board resolutions, rereading language they once skimmed, noticing how many times my signature appeared beside theirs in foundational moments. Because ownership isn't loud, it's recorded. And when legal opens the register again, this time more carefully, they'll realize something even more inconvenient. The equity isn't symbolic. It carries voting weight. If you think they're simply going to fix this quietly, you haven't considered what happens when documentation, audits, and 20 years of signed minutes all point in one direction. And trust me, you'll want to see how they try to negotiate with someone they thought had already left the building. If you've ever been underestimated in a room that thought it knew your worth, subscribe and stay with this story. The register has only just been opened. The meeting invitation arrived at 7:02 a.m., subject line, ownership clarification review. No emojis, no warmth, just precision. Conference room C again. Of course. There's something poetic about returning to the exact room where they handed you your exit papers. Same polished table, same glass walls, same faint hum in the air vents, but the energy? Entirely different. It felt like stepping back onto a chessboard after your opponent realized you're not a pawn. I arrived 5 minutes early. Not to impress, just to observe. Legal was already there. 2 senior partners this time. Not the junior associate who had whispered in confusion. That detail alone told me how seriously they were taking this. Martin walked in last. He looked composed. But composure has layers. If you know someone long enough, you learn where the cracks form first. "We've reviewed the documentation," Legal began, opening a thick folder. Paper this time. Printed. Tangible. As if ink might behave more obediently than pixels. "And?" I asked gently. "There is no executed removal of your equity allocation." No surprise. Still, hearing it spoken aloud altered the air pressure again. Martin leaned forward. The original intent was transitional. Intent, I repeated carefully, isn't the same as execution. A small flicker crossed Legal's face. Agreement, perhaps, or discomfort at the accuracy. They slid copies across the table: incorporation agreement, addendum, voting clause, audit confirmations. Year after year, the ownership register validated my position without objection. "Why didn't you say anything?" Martin asked suddenly. It wasn't accusation, it was bewilderment. I folded my hands. Because I wasn't trying to say anything. Silence. For 2 decades, I had focused on operations, strategy, stability. I didn't need the spotlight. The company grew. Investors rotated in and out. Executives changed. But foundational documents remained stubbornly loyal to ink. And ink doesn't forget. "We'd like to propose a buyout," Martin said, voice measured. There it was. Not denial, not dismissal, negotiation. "Based on current valuation," legal added, sliding another document forward. Numbers, clean, rounded, impressive on the surface, but numbers, like words, require context. I skimmed the sheet. They had calculated my share based on last quarter's conservative assessment. Interesting choice. "You're using pre-expansion figures," I noted. Martin blinked. "Those are the most recent audited statements, before the pending merger announcement." A pause. There it was again, that tightening of the room. The merger hadn't been public yet. But board discussions leave trails. Calendars, preliminary drafts, whispered hallway conversations that assume certain ears aren't listening. Ownership carries voting weight, and voting weight carries influence. "We haven't finalized anything," Martin said carefully. "Of course," I replied. Legal adjusted his glasses. "Are you implying you would oppose the merger?" I met his gaze evenly. "I'm implying that owners are entitled to full disclosure before making decisions. No threats, just structure." Outside the glass walls, employees moved past the corridor, pretending not to glance inside. News had traveled. The story had shifted from restructuring to something more intriguing. She might be an owner. Might. As if the ownership register were a rumor instead of a record, Martin exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" The question again, but this time it sounded different. Less like containment, more like recalibration. I let the silence breathe for a moment. Power doesn't rush to fill gaps. It waits. "I want transparency," I said. "Access to merger documentation, updated valuation reflecting current projections, and acknowledgement of my standing." Legal exchanged a look with Martin. "That's significant," Martin admitted. "So is 20 years. The words landed softly, but they didn't need force. For a brief second, something human flickered across his face. Memory, perhaps, of late nights, of early risks, of the days when survival depended on trust rather than titles. But companies evolve, memory becomes selective. Documentation doesn't. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now, or maybe it was just the weight of recalculations unfolding in real time. Legal cleared his throat. "We'll need to schedule a board session. I'll make myself available." No sarcasm, no triumph, just presence. As the meeting adjourned, Martin lingered. "You could have leveraged this years ago," he said quietly. "Yes." "Why now?" I picked up my bag. "Because you tried to erase me." It wasn't said with bitterness, just fact. There's a difference between quiet loyalty and convenient invisibility. One is chosen, the other is imposed. When I stepped into the corridor, conversations paused again. Eyes followed me, not with curiosity now, but with something closer to recalculation. The narrative had shifted, from employee to stakeholder, from exit to influence. Outside, the sky hung low and silver, like it was considering rain but hadn't decided yet. That's how the company felt now, suspended, waiting for pressure to tip it one way or the other. Back upstairs, they were likely rerunning projections, stress testing scenarios, imagining board votes that suddenly required one more voice, mine. And if they think this is just about money, they're underestimating the situation again. Because when you open the ownership register and discover a name you tried to remove from the building, the real question isn't how much it costs. It's how much control you just lost. The board session was scheduled for Friday at 4:30 p.m., an intentional choice. Late enough to exhaust everyone, early enough to avoid weekend headlines. Strategic fatigue is a common corporate tool. Decisions made when people are tired tend to favor whoever set the clock. I arrived prepared, not dramatically, not defensively, just organized. The leather folder was replaced by a structured binder, tabbed, cross-referenced, annotated. If the ownership register had awakened something in the company, today it would test whether they understood what it meant. The boardroom felt colder than usual. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city glowing in late afternoon light. The skyline looked confident, untouchable. Inside, the atmosphere was far less certain. 9 seats, 8 filled. The 9th, mine, no longer symbolic. Martin opened the meeting. His tone was professional, restrained. We're here to review equity clarification and its implications for the proposed merger. Implications. There it was again. Language trying to shrink gravity, legal projected the ownership register on the central screen. My name sat there calmly among founders and investors. No asterisk, no disclaimer, a fact. An investor representative shifted in his seat. How did this go unnoticed? Legal responded carefully. It didn't go unnoticed. It was verified annually. A subtle but critical distinction. I watched as realization spread slowly across faces accustomed to control. They hadn't missed it. They had simply never questioned it, because I never forced them to. Martin gestured toward me. You've requested access to merger documentation. Yes. You understand confidentiality constraints. I do. Owners are bound by them as well. A brief silence. Then the CFO began presenting updated projections. Expansion into new markets, synergy estimates, revenue acceleration curves glowing optimistically in blue and green. Impressive, also incomplete. When he finished, I opened my binder. I have a question regarding the projected cost reductions in Q3, I said evenly. Heads turned. The CFO paused. Go ahead. You're calculating operational savings assuming departmental consolidation. Has employee retention risk been factored into the forecast? A slight hesitation. It's within acceptable margins. Based on which retention model? I asked. The air shifted. Numbers are persuasive until someone asks how they were built. The CFO clicked through slides, searching. I already knew the answer. I had overseen operations long enough to understand human variables don't compress neatly into spreadsheets. Attrition spikes after leadership restructuring, I continued calmly, particularly when transparency is limited. Martin's jaw tightened slightly, not anger, recognition. The investor representative leaned forward. Are you suggesting the merger projections are overly optimistic? I'm suggesting they require refinement. Measured, precise, no theatrics. The boardroom didn't explode into conflict. It narrowed into focus. Questions multiplied. Assumptions were revisited. Risk exposure recalculated. My presence wasn't disruptive. It was inconveniently thorough. And thoroughness has a way of slowing momentum. An hour in, the energy had shifted from confident acceleration to careful reconsideration. Martin requested a brief recess. In the hallway, the city lights had begun to flicker on. The sky deepened into indigo. Reflections in the glass made it hard to tell where the building ended and the night began. Martin joined me near the window. This isn't about blocking the merger, is it? He asked quietly. No. Then what is it about? I watched traffic stream below, constant, directional, unstoppable. It's about accuracy. He studied me for a long moment. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder, I said softly, or clearer? He didn't answer, because clarity often feels like resistance to those accustomed to speed. Back inside, the board reconvened. The vote on immediate merger approval was postponed pending revised projections. Postponed. A small word with significant weight, not rejection, not approval, time. Time to reassess. Time to revalue. Time to negotiate with someone they had already escorted toward the exit. As members gathered their papers, the investor representative approached me. You've been quiet for 20 years, he said. I was working. He nodded slowly. You've just altered the trajectory of a 9-figure deal. Correction, I replied gently. I've aligned it with reality. He almost smiled. Almost. When the room finally emptied, I remained seated for a moment longer. The leather of the chair felt different now. Not borrowed, not temporary. Earned. The ownership register had done more than surprise them. It had restored equilibrium, and equilibrium forces recalculation. My phone buzzed as I stepped into the elevator. A message from legal. Will circulate revised valuation terms Monday. Revised. That word again. Small adjustments with large consequences. They were no longer negotiating from dismissal. They were negotiating from acknowledgement. But something else lingered beneath the surface, something they hadn't voiced yet. Because when equity carries voting weight and voting weight influences valuation and valuation affects merger leverage, the conversation stops being about removing someone. It becomes about how much it will cost to stand without them. And if you think Monday's revised terms will be straightforward, you're forgetting one critical detail buried deeper in the original agreements. A clause most of them haven't reread since year one. Monday arrived with a kind of brightness that feels almost deliberate. The revised valuation packet landed in my inbox at 8:03 a.m., not 8 o'clock, not 8:30. Precise, but cautious. The subject line had changed too. Equity alignment proposal. Alignment, not buyout, progress. I made coffee before opening it. Patience sharpens perception. The numbers were higher. Noticeably, updated merger projections included. Risk factors adjusted, more conservative this time. Employee retention sensitivity accounted for. Operational continuity weighted appropriately. They had listened. But they had also underestimated something again. Halfway through the document, I found the clause I'd been waiting for. Acceleration trigger upon change of control. Buried in the original agreements. Attached to my equity allocation as part of the early operational guarantee. If ownership structures shifted beyond a defined threshold, my percentage would adjust proportionally before dilution events. Incorporation year language. No one revisits incorporation year language unless forced to. The pending merger qualified as a change of control, which meant the recalculated valuation they sent me. It still didn't reflect the acceleration mechanism. I leaned back in my chair, not smiling, just aware. 20 years ago, I had signed under fluorescent lights in a half-furnished office because they needed credibility fast. The clause had been their lawyer's idea, a way to protect the guarantor in case external investors restructured control. Back then, it felt theoretical. Today, it was arithmetic. My phone rang. Martin. You've reviewed the proposal? He asked. I have. And? It's improved. A careful exhale from his end, but incomplete. Silence. He knew. There's a particular quiet that happens when two people understand the same document at the same time. You're referring to the acceleration clause, he said finally. Yes. That clause was drafted for protection in case of hostile restructuring. Change of control is change of control, I replied evenly. Another pause. Invoking it would significantly increase your equity position. It would enforce the agreement. Not escalation. Enforcement. The difference matters. We didn't anticipate you'd rely on it, he admitted. I almost laughed, not mockingly, just softly. You didn't anticipate I'd still be here. The truth settled between us without bitterness. For 2 decades, my presence had been functional, essential, but quiet. I wasn't a headline. I wasn't a risk. I was structure. Structures are rarely noticed until someone tries to remove them. We need to reassess, he said. I understand. And you're not opposed to the merger itself? No. Another stretch of silence. Then why push this? I looked out the window at the city. Sunlight struck the glass towers at an angle that made them blaze for a moment before settling back into neutrality. Because accuracy builds stability, I said, and instability is expensive. He absorbed that. Behind him, I could imagine conference rooms filling again, legal recalculating dilution models, investors revisiting leverage scenarios. The narrative had shifted once more, from containment to negotiation to recalibration under constraint. Ownership doesn't shout, it corrects. By Wednesday, a new proposal arrived. This one acknowledged the acceleration trigger. The numbers were no longer just impressive, they were respectful. In addition, a formal statement recognizing my status as a founding equity holder, not symbolic, explicit. The language was precise, careful, public ready if necessary. I reviewed it twice. Then I requested one final adjustment, a structured advisory role through the merger transition period, limited term, clearly defined scope. No operational micromanagement, just strategic continuity. Martin called within minutes. You want back in? I never left. A quiet laugh this time, from him. This changes the optics. It stabilizes them. By Friday, the agreement was signed. Not my exit, my alignment. The revised ownership register was circulated to the board with updated percentages reflecting the acceleration clause. No one questioned it this time. Documentation had spoken. When I walked into the building the following Monday, no one whispered. They nodded. Respect looks different from curiosity. Conference Room C no longer felt like a place where endings were handed out in envelopes. It felt like a room recalibrated. The merger moved forward, revised projections, clearer transparency, balanced governance. And me? I didn't celebrate loudly. There was no dramatic victory speech, no triumphant confrontation, just equilibrium restored. They had tried to cut me loose. Instead, they reopened the foundation. And when legal asked, weeks later, why is her name listed as owner? The answer was no longer confusion. It was simple, because it always was. Ownership isn't granted by mood. It's recorded in ink, protected by clauses, and confirmed by time. And sometimes, the quietest name in the register carries the strongest weight.